The wagon had been rolling for the better part of a day when the land changed. Wren Calloway noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcing herself. The scrub brush grew thicker along the roadside, and the grass flattened under a wind that came from nowhere and went nowhere, just moved across the open country like something restless that had never learned to stop. The sky above was enormous. That was the only word for it. Enormous and pale and indifferent in the way that only wide-open places could be indifferent, as though the land beneath it had long since stopped asking to be noticed. She had the letter in her coat pocket. She had read it so many times the fold lines were soft as cloth. Fletcher Guard, proprietor, Guard Ranch. A man who wrote in careful, measured sentences that said very little while implying a great deal. He had described the land. He had described the house. He had mentioned, in the second-to-last paragraph, that he had a young son who would benefit from a woman's presence. He had not described the boy further. Wren had noticed that even then, reading it the first time at the small table in her rented room back east, the winter light thin and gray through the window. She had noticed it and told herself it meant nothing. The wagon driver did not speak. He was an older man with a beard the color of dried grass, and he had not spoken much beyond what was necessary since collecting her from the relay station that morning. She did not mind. She had grown accustomed to her own company over the past 2 years, grown accustomed to the silence of a woman who has lost things she does not know how to name in polite conversation. Her husband had died in the 3rd winter of their marriage, a fever that came fast and left faster, taking him before the doctor arrived and leaving Wren with a house that belonged to his family and a grief that belonged to no one. They had been kind about it, his family, the polite kind, the kind that made clear the house would need to be returned. She had not argued. There was nothing left in that house she wanted to keep, except the small cedar box she carried in her traveling trunk, and the white handkerchief folded inside it, embroidered with violet flowers along one edge. She had stitched those flowers herself, sitting beside a window in a different house, waiting for a different kind of loss to arrive. She did not think about the handkerchief often, but she knew it was there. The relay station agent had looked at her with the expression people reserved for mail-order brides, a mixture of pity and curiosity that she had learned to meet with a steady gaze and nothing more. She was not ashamed of the choice. She was practical. She had always been practical, even when practicality cost her something. The advertisement had said the position was permanent. It had said the man was decent. It had said there was land and a house and a future of some kind waiting at the other end of the road. She was holding on to the word future the way a person holds onto a rope in deep water. Not because the rope is beautiful, because it is there. There was something clarifying about land that did not pretend to care. She had spent 2 years in rooms where the walls held the residue of other people's concern, their careful questions and their careful silences, all of it shaped around the fact of her loss in a way that made her feel she was being preserved in amber rather than allowed to continue. Here the land asked nothing of her. It simply extended in every direction and waited to see what she would do with herself in it. She was still deciding. The wagon crested a low rise, and Wren saw the ranch. It was larger than she had imagined. Not large in the way of wealth precisely, but large in the way of age. The kind of place that had been built piece by piece over many years, each edition slightly different from the last, as though every decade had added something without quite matching what was already there. The main house was 2 stories, timber and stone, with a wide porch running the length of the front. Outbuildings spread behind it, a barn, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse set back from the rest. The fencing was good. The paddocks were clean. Someone had taken care of this place, or was taking care of it still, and she noted that the way she noted most things, filed it away, let it mean what it would mean later. What she noticed first, though, before the house, before the fencing, before any of it, was the silence. There were no children's sounds, no voice calling out, no small feet on the porch boards, no laughter carried on the wind. She had known, from the letter, that there was a boy of 6. A boy of 6 was not a quiet thing, as a rule. A boy of 6 filled the space around him the way boys that age always did, with motion and noise and the particular urgency of someone who has not yet learned that the world does not require his constant announcement. But the porch was empty. The yard was empty. The only movement came from a man emerging from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, stopping when he saw the wagon approach. He was not Fletcher Guard. She knew that because Fletcher Guard came out of the house a moment later, and the two men could not have been more different. Fletcher Guard was tall and well presented, wearing a clean shirt and a jacket despite the hour and the dust, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a smile that arrived precisely on time, like something he had practiced in a mirror until it looked effortless. He raised a hand as the wagon pulled up. He came down the porch steps with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to being the person others watched enter a room. The other man stayed by the barn. Wren registered him the way she registered the silence, quietly, without comment. He was lean and weathered, the kind of lean that came from years of outdoor work rather than want, with a hat that had seen better seasons and hands that were still holding the rag even though he had stopped wiping them. He was watching her. Not the way Fletcher Guard was watching her, which was the watching of a man prepared to make an impression. He was watching her the way a person watches something they are trying to decide about, still and careful, and when her eyes moved to his, he did not look away immediately. He held the look for a moment, just a moment, and then he turned and went back into the barn. She had half a second to wonder what she had seen in his expression before Fletcher Guard was at the wagon, offering his hand to help her down. "Miss Calloway." His voice was warm and assured. "Welcome to Guard Ranch. I hope the road wasn't too unkind to you." "It was fine," she said. She took his hand and stepped down. The ground was harder than she expected, dry and packed. "Thank you for having me." "The thanks are mutual, I assure you." He released her hand with the exact right amount of promptness, not too quickly, not long enough to suggest anything. "You must be tired. We'll get your things brought in, and Mrs. Lenora will have something warm for you." She was looking at the porch. She had not meant to make it obvious, but she was looking at the porch because there was something on the bottom step that Fletcher Guard had not mentioned. A pair of small boots, brown leather, worn at the toes, sitting side by side with the careful placement that suggested whoever had taken them off had been told more than once to leave them tidy. Small boots. The boots of a child who had learned, early, to be neat. "Your son," she said, "is he inside?" Something moved through Fletcher Guard's expression. It was brief, and she might have imagined it, but she did not think she had. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, just slightly, adjusting to an unexpected direction. Then the smile returned, easy as ever. "Owen tends to keep to himself when there are strangers about," he said. "He'll come around. He's a quiet boy." She nodded. She looked at the boots one more moment, then followed him inside. The house was well kept in the way that houses are kept when someone has worked hard to maintain the appearance of order. Everything was in its place. The furniture was solid and functional, nothing frivolous, nothing that suggested someone had chosen it out of pleasure rather than purpose. There were no flowers. There were no small objects on the windowsills that a woman might have set there because they caught the light in a way she liked. There were no pictures on the walls except one. A landscape hung in the hallway at a height that suggested a man had chosen where to put it. She followed Fletcher through the main hall, noting everything, saying nothing. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it was warmer than the rest of it, and it smelled of wood smoke and something savory that had been simmering long enough to fill the room completely. A woman stood at the stove. She was older, perhaps 60, with white hair pulled back and hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who had cooked in this kitchen long enough to do it in the dark. She looked up when Wren entered, and the look she gave was not the same look as Fletcher Guard's. It was quicker, and it went deeper, and it took in more. "This is Mrs. Lenora," Fletcher said. "She keeps the house." "Ma'am," Wren said. "Miss Calloway." Mrs. Lenora's voice was careful, neutral in the specific way of someone who had learned to keep her voice neutral as a matter of survival. She held Wren's gaze a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then she turned back to the stove. "Supper'll be ready inside the hour." Wren was shown to a room on the second floor. It was clean. There was a window that looked out over the paddocks, and she could see the barn from where she stood, and the lean figure of the man from earlier moving between the paddock fence and the water trough with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this particular route so many times his body remembered it without being asked. She watched him for a moment. She had not learned his name yet. Fletcher had not offered it. She unpacked what she needed for the evening and left the rest in the trunk. The handkerchief she moved to the pocket of her dress, a habit so old she no longer thought about it. She smoothed her hair, straightened her collar, and went back downstairs because she had not come this far to sit alone in a room. The kitchen drawer was the first thing she did not mean to find. She was looking for a spoon. Mrs. Lenora had stepped outside for a moment, and Wren had offered to help with the table, a genuine offer made in the genuine hope of being useful. And the drawer she opened was the wrong drawer. She knew it immediately because it did not have spoons. It had a folded cloth napkin, and beneath the napkin, a piece of paper, and on the paper, in the uneven lines of a child's hand who had not been drawing very long, was a picture. She stood still and looked at it. Two figures, a woman and a small figure beside her, their hands joined, both of them leaning forward as though moving quickly, moving away from something. Behind them, filling the right side of the page in heavy strokes, was a shape, not a clear shape. Not a shape that could be named precisely, but large and dark, and behind them. At the bottom of the page, in letters that wandered up and down from the line like children learning to walk, someone had written two words, "Mama gone." Wren's hand was very still against the drawer edge. She looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she heard a sound from the hallway, small, hesitant, and she folded the napkin back over the paper and closed the drawer. She turned. In the kitchen doorway, at the edge of the lamplight, was a boy. He was small for 6, or perhaps he only seemed small because of the way he stood. Shoulders slightly curved, head tilted down, feet placed close together on the threshold as though he was not fully committed to entering the room. His hair was dark, and his eyes were light, an unusual combination, and those light eyes were fixed on her with an expression she recognized immediately because she had worn it herself, at various points in her life. It was the expression of someone waiting to find out what kind of person they were dealing with. "Hello," she said. She did not move toward him. She kept her voice even and quiet, the voice she used when she wanted to be heard without startling. "You must be Owen." He did not answer, but he did not leave. "I'm Wren," she said. "I'm new here, which I expect you already know. I don't know my way around the kitchen yet, so if I get in Mrs. Lenora's way, you'll have to tell me." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but something that was adjacent to the possibility of a smile if given enough time. He might have said something. She thought he might have. She thought she saw him draw a breath and prepare. But then a sound came from the hallway. Fletcher Guard's footstep, distinct and measured. And the possibility closed like a window in a sudden wind. Owen's shoulders came up. His eyes went to the floor. By the time Fletcher stepped into the kitchen doorway, the boy had made himself very small in a way that Wren suspected he had practiced without knowing he was practicing it. "Ah, good," Fletcher said, with the warm ease of a man who noticed nothing. "You've met Owen. Come along then. Supper's nearly ready." Owen moved to the table without being told again. He moved the way children move when they have learned that being told twice is worse than moving the first time. Wren watched him settle into his chair, carefully, quietly, and she sat across from him, and she smiled at him when he glanced up, and he looked away. She thought about the drawing in the drawer. She thought about the two figures leaning forward, and the dark shape behind them, and the words at the bottom in letters that wandered like children learning to walk. Supper was quiet. Fletcher Guard spoke easily and well, the way men speak when they are accustomed to setting the tone of a room. He asked about her journey, her impressions of the land, whether she had family back east. She answered each question truthfully and without elaboration, the way she had learned to answer questions she had not entirely decided how to feel about. He was charming. She had known from his letters that he would be charming. She was watching for what lay behind the charm the way you watch for the current beneath the surface of a river, because the surface is rarely the whole story. Owen ate without speaking. He kept his eyes on his plate with the focused attention of someone performing a task. Once she dropped her napkin and bent to retrieve it, and when she came back up, she caught him watching her, a quick, serious look, like an assessment. And then his eyes went back to his plate. After supper she could not sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation ever since she lost the baby, that small, brief life that had flickered and gone before it had the chance to become anything she could describe to another person. She did not speak of it. There were no words that fit the shape of that particular grief, none that she had found, and so she carried it the way she carried the cloth in her pocket, close and quiet, and always there. She lay in the room above the paddocks and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds, the creak of timber cooling, the wind against the eaves, horses moving in the dark, and then, close to midnight, something else, a sound from down the hall, soft, thin, the sound of someone trying not to make a sound and not quite managing. A child who was not sleeping. A child who was crying in the practiced, muffled way of someone who had learned that crying loudly brought consequences. Wren sat up. She lit the small lamp on the nightstand and held it low so the light would not spill far, and she opened her door as quietly as she could and stepped into the hallway. He was already there. The man from the barn, the one whose name she still did not know, stood at the far end of the hallway, outside the door she understood to be Owen's. He stood with one hand on the wall and one hand at his side, his hat gone, his hair darker without it, his face turned toward the door. His jaw was tight. His eyes were closed. He was listening to the sound from inside the room, that thin, careful, muffled sound, and his hand on the wall had gone white at the knuckles from the grip. He had not gone in. He was standing outside a child's door in the middle of the night, listening to that child cry. And he had not gone in. She did not know if it was because he had been told not to, or because he did not know how, or because some other reason had frozen him in the hallway. But he was there. He was there, and he was not moving, and his knuckles were white on the wall. He heard her. He turned. In the low lamplight, face to face across the narrow hallway, she saw what she had not been able to see clearly in the yard, the age that had settled around his eyes, the kind that came not from years, but from specific things that had happened within those years. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. She was not sure what it was. Then his face closed, went carefully neutral, and he straightened and looked away. She moved toward Owen's door. He said nothing. She set her hand on the latch and looked back at him once. He looked at the floor. She went in. Owen was curled against the headboard with his knees pulled up and his face in his arms. He did not look up when she entered, and she understood he had expected it to be someone else, or had expected no one at all. She sat on the edge of the bed without touching him and said nothing for a moment, just let her presence be a fact in the room, something he could choose to accept or not. "I can't sleep either," she said at last, very quietly. "I thought maybe we were both just awake." He lifted his head. His face was wet, and he was not embarrassed by it, which told her something, that he was either too young or too tired to be embarrassed. He looked at her with those light, serious eyes and said nothing. "It's all right," she said. "You don't have to say anything." He didn't, but he uncurled very slightly and moved one knee down from the headboard, and she understood that as what it was, a small concession, a small beginning. She sat with him until his breathing slowed. When she returned to the hallway, it was empty. He had gone. She stood alone in the dark hallway for a moment and looked at the place where he had been standing, at the faint impression of his hand still visible on the wallpaper beside Owen's door. And she thought, very clearly, without anything soft about the thought, that something was wrong in this house, and that she had known it since the wagon crested the rise, and she saw the empty porch, and heard nothing, and saw only a pair of small boots sitting side by side on the bottom step. She went back to her room. She lay down in the dark. She pressed one hand flat against the pocket of her dress and felt the shape of the folded cloth beneath. In the morning she would find the man from the barn, and she would learn his name, and she would ask him what he knew. She did not yet know what she would do with the answer. She only knew she was going to ask. She had come a long way. She had left everything she once was and come a long way, following the word future down a road that ended here, in a house that was clean and quiet and wrong in ways she could not yet name. She was not leaving, not until she understood what she was staying for. The man's name was Silas Holt. She learned it the way she learned most things about this place. Not from Fletcher Guard, who offered information the way a careful man offers money, in measured amounts and only when necessary, but from the ranch itself. From the way Mrs. Lenora said it in the morning when she sent the boy to find him for a broken fence latch. From the way the other hands said it when they needed something. From the way Owen's eyes moved automatically toward the barn whenever the name was spoken, the way a child's eyes move toward the thing they trust most without knowing they are doing it. Silas Holt, 35 years old, or thereabouts, though the outdoors had been generous with the years it showed on his face. He had been managing Guard Ranch for 4 years. He knew every fence line and water source and weak point in the property, the way a man knows a place he has given himself to without reservation. The other hands deferred to him without being asked to. Fletcher Guard spoke to him the way an employer speaks to someone he both needs and resents needing, with a surface cordiality that had a harder thing underneath it. Wren spent her first full day at the ranch learning the shape of the place, and she spent a portion of it learning the shape of Silas Holt, because he was part of the place in a way that Fletcher Guard, for all his ownership of it, did not seem to be. She watched him from the kitchen window while she helped Mrs. Lenora with the breakfast things. He moved through the yard with a purposefulness that did not hurry, checking fence rails and water troughs and the condition of a gate that was beginning to lean. He stopped once and crouched beside a horse that had come to the paddock fence, running one hand along its neck, and the horse did not pull away. He stayed there a moment longer than was necessary for any practical purpose. Then he stood and moved on. She had the sense, watching him, of a man who had taught himself to be content with his own company and was no longer sure whether that was a virtue or a wound. She found him that afternoon near the barn, mending a section of fence with the focused quietness of someone who preferred not to be interrupted. She came to stand at the edge of his work without announcing herself, which she suspected was the right approach for a man like this, and waited. He knew she was there. She was certain he knew. He finished the knot he was working before he looked up. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not rise or fall, much regardless of circumstance. A voice that had made its peace with restraint. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, though she was not entirely sorry. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. We didn't get the chance yesterday." "No," he agreed. He did not say anything further about why that was. She looked at the fence, then back at him. "You're Silas Holt." "That's right. I'm Wren Calloway." He nodded once, as though this were information he already possessed, which she supposed it was. She let the silence sit for a moment, the way she had learned to let silences sit, without filling them immediately, without performing comfort she did not feel. The wind moved through the grass beyond the fence. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted its weight against a stall door. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 4 years. "You know this place well, then?" "Well enough." He had gone back to the fence, not rudely, just with the practicality of a man who believed that work did not pause for conversation. She watched his hands on the wire and thought about the hallway. She thought about his knuckles, white on the wallpaper, and his eyes closed, and the sound of Owen crying, muffled and careful, on the other side of the door. "Owen," she said. The hands on the wire did not stop, but something changed in the set of his shoulders. Something gathered and held. "What about him?" Silas said. It was not precisely a question. "He's a quiet boy." "He is. Children that age aren't usually quiet." He said nothing. "Were you always going to tell me?" she said. "Or were you waiting to see what kind of person I was first?" That stopped him. He set down the tool he was holding and looked at her fully, and it was the same look she had caught in the yard the day before. The careful, assessing look of a man who did not give his attention to things that hadn't earned it. He was deciding something. She could see him deciding it. "Don't ask," he said finally. "Questions you're not ready for the answers to." It was not what she had expected. She had expected deflection, or politeness, or the blankness of a man who had decided not to be involved. This was different. This was a warning, and warnings implied knowledge. And knowledge meant he knew something she did not. "I'm ready," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the tool and went back to the fence. "Go back inside, Miss Calloway," he said. "Supper'll be along in a few hours." She went. But she did not go far, and she did not stop thinking. The days at Guard Ranch had a rhythm that she learned quickly, because learning rhythms was something she did well, the way she did most practical things well. Breakfast early, the hands out by full light, Fletcher Guard taking his coffee on the porch before riding out to oversee whatever required his attention that day. He was often away during the daylight hours, which meant the house breathed differently when he was gone, a thing she noticed on the second day and confirmed on the third. The way Mrs. Lenora's shoulders came down when the sound of his horse faded beyond the rise, the way Owen emerged from whatever corner he had found for himself and moved more freely through the rooms. On the third morning, Owen found her in the kitchen. She was attempting biscuits, which she had made competently before, but which required a particular feel for the dough that she was still negotiating with the kitchen's oven. Owen appeared in the doorway the way children appear when they want something, but haven't yet decided to ask. At the threshold, watching, calculating the odds. She did not make a production of noticing him. She kept working the dough and said, without looking up, that she was having some trouble and could use a second opinion on whether the consistency looked right. He came in. He stood beside her at the table and looked at the dough with the gravity of a small person being consulted on a serious matter. He said solemnly that it looked too wet. She agreed that it probably was. She added a small amount of flour. He watched. She worked it in. She asked if that was better. He considered for a long moment, then nodded. "Good," she said. "I'll rely on you for quality control then." The edge of his mouth moved. Not a full smile, but the edge of one, the barest suggestion. There and gone, like a brief light through clouds. Those days established a pattern that Wren had not planned for, but found herself depending on more than she had anticipated. Each morning when Fletcher rode out, the house underwent its quiet transformation. Mrs. Lenora's humming returned to the kitchen, a low, private sound she seemed unaware of making, the kind that comes back to a person when they have forgotten, briefly, to be afraid. Owen moved through the rooms with a looseness in his limbs that disappeared the instant he heard a horse approaching from the wrong direction. She learned him slowly, the way you learn a place that has been closed off for a long time, room by room, the way each space held light differently, the way certain things should be approached and certain others left alone until they were ready. He did not like loud noises, even ordinary ones, even the clatter of a dropped pot in the kitchen, which told her something. He did not like doorways left half open, which told her more. He preferred to know where everyone in the house was at any given time, and had developed, without knowing it, a talent for tracking the location of each adult by sound alone. But he also had, and this she found herself grateful for in a way that surprised her, a dry, private humor that revealed itself in small flashes when he felt safe enough. He noticed things, the way a particular cloud resembled something improbable, the gap in the fence where the black cat always entered the yard, and his wordless satisfaction at having been the one to map it. When she told him that she had once, as a girl, tried to make soup from things she found in the garden without knowing what any of them were, He looked at her for a long moment with those light, serious eyes and said, "Did anyone eat it?" She said no. She had tasted it first and made a judgment. He thought about this. Then he said, "That was sensible," and went back to the dough. It was in those ordinary moments, the biscuits, the wordless tracking of each other's movements through the kitchen, the evenings when she read aloud from whatever book she could find on the shelf while he sat near enough to hear without quite admitting he was listening, that she understood what she had not understood when she first saw those small boots on the bottom step. She had thought she was arriving at a house. What she had arrived at was the possibility of a home, which was an entirely different thing and required an entirely different kind of staying. Fletcher Guard returned that afternoon. She watched from the side of the window the way Owen heard the horse, the way his whole body changed, the casual freedom of his movements in the kitchen replaced by something tighter, quieter, more controlled. By the time Fletcher came through the door, Owen was seated at the table with his hands folded, and anyone who had not been watching him a moment before would not have noticed that anything had changed at all. But she had been watching. That evening after supper, while Fletcher sat in the front room with his reading, she found Mrs. Lenora in the kitchen cleaning the pots and asked if she could help. Mrs. Lenora looked at her sidelong, assessing, and then handed her a drying cloth. They worked in the companionable silence of women who have an understanding that something is being decided between them. "The boy," Wren said after a while, quietly, without looking up from the pot she was drying. Mrs. Lenora's hands did not stop. "What about him? His mother? There's nothing of her in the house." A pause, very brief. "No," Mrs. Lenora said, "there isn't." "What happened to her?" The older woman looked at the window above the sink. Outside, the yard was dark, and the lamplight turned the glass into a mirror that showed their reflections back at them, two women in a kitchen, side by side. Mrs. Lenora looked at her own reflection for a moment. "She was here before you," she said finally. "Came the same way you came. Letter, arrangement, long road." Her hands resumed their work, slower now. "She was here for 7 months. And then she was gone." Mrs. Lenora set a pot down on the shelf and picked up the next one. "Mr. Guard said she decided to leave. Said she wasn't suited to the life out here. Said she went of her own choosing." The way she said it made clear what she thought of that explanation. Wren kept drying. Her hands were very steady. "You didn't believe that." Mrs. Lenora looked at her then, directly, and the look held something that Wren recognized. Not quite fear, but the permanent watchfulness of a person who has lived alongside fear long enough that it had become a condition of their existence rather than a response to a specific thing. "She left without her case," Mrs. Lenora said, "without anything she'd brought with her." She turned back to the pot in her hands. "I've never seen a woman leave a place willingly and not take her things." Wren was quiet. "There's a man," Mrs. Lenora said, even more softly now, barely above the sound of the water in the basin. "Stays at the barn early in the mornings, before anyone else is about." She did not look at Wren when she said it. "If you were the kind of woman who walked early, if you happened to be out that way," she said nothing more. But she had said enough. Wren folded the drying cloth and set it on the rail beside the stove, and she said good night to Mrs. Lenora, and she went upstairs, and she lay in the dark and thought about 7 months, and a case left behind, and a child who had learned to make himself small, and she thought about those things for a very long time. She rose before full light. The yard was gray and cool. The sky, the particular silver of early morning, when the dark has gone, but the day has not yet committed to arriving. She crossed the yard quietly, her boots on the packed earth, and pushed open the barn door. He was there. Silas Holt stood beside the chestnut mare's stall, running a brush along her neck in long, even strokes, and he did not stop when the door opened. He had heard her coming. She was certain he had heard her, the way he was certain of most things that moved within his radius. He kept brushing, and she came to stand at the edge of the stall, and she waited. "Early," he said. "I know." She folded her hands on the top rail of the stall door. The mare looked at her with the calm, dark eyes of an animal that had decided she was not a threat. "I spoke with Mrs. Lenora last night." The brush kept moving, slow and even, shoulder to flank. "She told me about the woman before me," Wren said, "that she came the same way I came, that she left without her things." Nothing. The brush on the horse's coat. "You knew her," Wren said. It was not a question. He stopped brushing. He stood with his hand resting on the mare's side and looked at nothing in particular, at the middle distance of the stall beyond the horse's head, and the morning light came through the high window at the end of the barn and lay across his face in a way that showed her what was there. Not nothing. A man could not do what she suspected he had done. Stand outside a child's door and listen to that child cry and not go in, and have nothing in his face. What was there was something older and heavier than nothing. What was there was the expression of a person who had made a decision they had not yet finished paying for. "She was here 7 months," he said finally. "Her name was Ada." "What happened to her?" He was quiet for a long time. The mare shifted, and he moved with her without thinking about it, the automatic adjustment of someone who spent more time with horses than people and had learned their rhythms from the inside. "One night there was an argument," he said. "I was in the bunkhouse, late. I heard it. Voices, one of them hers and one that wasn't." He paused. "I got up. I walked to the house. I stood outside the door." She waited, and I didn't go in, he said. "I stood there and I listened, and then the voices stopped, and I went back." He looked at the horse's neck, at his own hand still resting there. By morning, she was gone. Fletcher said she'd left in the night, that she'd decided the life wasn't what she'd expected. His jaw tightened. He said it to everyone. He said it enough times that it became the thing that was said. "But you didn't believe it," Wren said. Her voice was very quiet. "No," he said. "I didn't believe it." "Because of the case," she said. He looked at her then. Something moved in his face. A question. Reassessment. "I found it," she said, "in the storeroom, packed, folded, her things still inside." A long silence settled in the barn. Outside, the light was growing, the silver of the sky shifting toward gold, and the sounds of the ranch beginning its day drifted in from the yard. A horse from the far paddock, the distant clank of the water pump, one of the hands calling to another in the unhurried voice of a morning task. "He has someone," Silas said finally. His voice had dropped lower, the register of something he had not said aloud before. "A man he answers to. Someone in this territory with enough standing that no one asks questions Fletcher doesn't want asked. That's why nothing came of it. That's why Ada was just a woman who decided to leave." He paused. "There's nothing that can be done that doesn't go through that same wall." She looked at him steadily. "You've been thinking about it for 18 months, and you haven't found a way through." Something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness. Worse than that, agreement. No, he said. Then we need to think differently. She said it simply, the way she said most things, without drama, without performance, because the situation itself contained enough of both. Will you help me? He looked at her for a long moment. The mare moved again, and he stepped back, and for a moment she thought he was going to say no. She thought he was going to say, "This isn't your business. You've been here 4 days. You don't understand what you're asking, all the reasonable things a reasonable person might say. This isn't something you walk back from," he said. "Once you start looking, really looking, you can't unknow what you find." "I know that," she said. "Fletcher isn't a man who ignores things that threaten him. I know that too." He looked at her face. Whatever he found there seemed to settle something in him, some question he had been asking since the wagon pulled into the yard, and she stepped down and looked at the boots on the porch. "I'll think on it," he said. It was not yes, but it was not no, and she had learned to tell the difference. She was almost to the barn door when he spoke again. "Miss Calloway." She stopped and looked back. He was still beside the mare, his hand on her neck, the morning light across his face. "Your question yesterday, about what kind of person you were, when you asked if I was waiting to find out." She waited. "I wasn't waiting," he said. "I knew from the yard. When you looked at those boots." He paused. "That's why I didn't want you to ask." She understood what he meant. She left without saying it out loud. Fletcher Guard told her about the wedding date that evening at dinner. 2 weeks, he said. A smaller ceremony would suit the season. He said it so smoothly, so easily. The way a man announces something he has already decided is not up for discussion. The arrangement had terms, and the terms were moving forward, and certain things were now in motion. She sat across the table and smiled in the right places and looked at Owen eating his supper with his eyes on his plate. And she thought about a packed case in a storeroom and a woman named Ada who had not taken her things. She looked at Owen and thought, someone has to stay. Later that night, she went back to the kitchen drawer. She opened it and moved the cloth napkin and looked at the drawing again. The 2 figures leaning forward. The dark shape behind them. The careful, wandering letters at the bottom. She closed the drawer. She stood in the kitchen alone and looked out the window at the dark yard, at the faint light still showing under the barn door. And she thought about Silas Holt standing in the hallway in the middle of the night, knuckles white on the wallpaper, not going in. She thought about Ada. She thought about what it meant that Ada had folded her things neatly into the case before she disappeared. A woman in a hurry did not fold things. A woman who had chosen to leave did not fold things and then leave them behind. But a woman who had expected to be leaving soon, who had planned it, who had packed in the hope of the plan working out. A woman like that might fold everything carefully, might pack everything she owned, might put on her coat and pick up her case, and then not make it to the door. Wren stood in that kitchen a long time. Then she went upstairs, and she checked that her door latched properly, and she lay down in the dark, and she began to plan. She was still planning when she heard it. Much later, close to the same hour as the night before, the thin, muffled sound from down the hall. Owen, crying in the practiced, careful way of a child who had learned what too much sound cost. She lay still for a moment. She thought about Silas in the hallway, and about the door he had not opened, and she thought that some things became possible only when a person stopped finding reasons they were not. She got up. She went down the hall. She went in. Owen was in the same position as before, curled against the headboard, face in his arms. But this time, when she sat on the edge of the bed, he lifted his head almost immediately, as though he had been waiting, as though he had known she would come back. "Owen," she said softly, "do you remember your mama?" He was very still. Then he nodded. "Just once. She loved you," Wren said. Not a question, a fact, offered simply, the way you offer water to someone who has been a long time without it. "I can see that she did." His face did something complicated that she recognized, the expression of someone holding something large and heavy and not entirely sure they are allowed to put it down. "She told me," he said. His voice was small, rusty with disuse and crying. "She told me she was going to take me somewhere safe." A pause. "She didn't." "What happened to her?" she said, as softly as she could make it. Owen looked at his hands. He was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Then, "I don't know," he said. "I heard her, loud, and then I didn't hear her anymore." His voice did not waver, which was somehow worse than if it had. "And in the morning, she wasn't there." She sat with that for a moment. Not the silence of someone waiting for more, but the silence of someone absorbing what had been given. 6 years old, and he had been carrying this account inside him with nowhere to put it. The exact sequence of sounds that had marked the last night his life had one shape before it became another. She thought of all the mornings she had sat with her own version of that night, her own precise inventory of sounds and silences, and how long it had taken before she could let anyone else into the room where she kept it. He had let her in. She understood the weight of that. She thought also of the drawing in the kitchen drawer, the two figures leaning forward, moving away from the dark shape behind them. Owen had drawn that picture at some point in the months since Ada's absence, had folded it into a napkin and left it in a drawer where it might be found. She did not think he had put it there deliberately for her to find. She thought he had put it there the way children put things. Somewhere that felt like safekeeping, somewhere between himself and the world, close enough to revisit and far enough to survive. Wren reached out and set her hand over his, very lightly, the way you set something down on a surface you're not sure will hold. He didn't pull away. She sat with him until long after his breathing slowed into sleep. And then she sat a little longer in the dark, listening to the ranch settle around them. And she thought about 2 weeks, and about a packed case in a storeroom, and about a woman named Ada who had planned to leave and had folded everything neatly and had not made it to the door. She thought about what Silas had said. This isn't something you walk back from. She looked at Owen's sleeping face. She thought about her own lost weight, that small, brief life, and about how grief like that either breaks a person down to nothing or leaves behind something harder than what was there before. She was not walking back from anything. The old woman's name was Lenora Birch, and she had been at Guard Ranch longer than anyone else still living on it. Wren found this out the way she found out most things about the ranch, through patience and proximity, through being present and useful and not asking too much at once. Mrs. Lenora had been cook and housekeeper here for 11 years, through 2 different sets of hands, through a drought that had taken half the herd, through Fletcher Guard's first arrangement that had come to nothing, and then through Ada, and now through this. She had stayed because she was practical, and because she had nowhere else that was better, and because leaving felt like abandoning something she could not name precisely, but could not walk away from either. Wren understood that feeling. She had built her life around similar calculations. On the 7th day, She asked Mrs. Lenora if she would walk with her after the dinner things were cleared. "Just a short walk," she said, "for the air." Mrs. Lenora looked at her the way she had looked at her that first evening, the quick, deep look that took in more than it showed, and then she untied her apron and set it on the peg, and said she supposed the air wouldn't hurt either of them. They walked to the far end of the kitchen garden, where the light from the house did not quite reach, and the darkness of the open land began. They stood at the low fence at the garden's edge and looked out at the dark, and Wren waited. And eventually, Mrs. Lenora began to talk. She had seen it, she said. Not all of it, not the end of it, but enough. She described the night the way a person describes something they have replayed so many times it has worn smooth. The details precise, the emotion around them controlled into something manageable. Fletcher and another man in the yard, voices low, and Ada's voice above them briefly, high and urgent, and then not. The other man had come and gone in the dark on a horse with no lantern, which was not a thing a person with nothing to hide did. Fletcher had come back inside. In the morning he was at breakfast by the usual time, with the usual expression, and Ada was not there. And when Mrs. Lenora had asked, he had said she left in the night, and the way he said it made clear that was the only version of events that existed. "The man," Wren said, "the one who came in the dark. Did you know him?" Mrs. Lenora was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the garden and moved through the dry stalks of things that had grown there in better seasons. "I knew his horse," she said finally. "A gray with a white blaze. Belongs to a man named Harlan Creed. He owns the largest parcel of land on this side of the valley. He and Fletcher have been in business together for longer than I've been here." She paused. "He's a man people don't argue with. Not because he's violent, because he doesn't need to be. He has enough of everything else." Wren was quiet, letting that sit, letting it join the other things she had collected and was holding together in the shape of a picture she did not yet fully have. "You've been afraid for 18 months, Wren said. Not an accusation, just naming what was there. "Yes," Mrs. Lenora said simply. "Were you afraid before that, when Ada was here?" A long pause. "I should have said something," the old woman said. "When I saw her packing, I knew she was planning to leave. I could have—" She stopped, started again. "I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself she was grown, and she had made her own decision, and it wasn't my business to involve myself in it." Her voice had gone thin, not with age, but with the weight of what she was carrying. "I've had a long time to think about what my place should have been." Wren put her hand over Mrs. Lenora's where it rested on the fence rail. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence, and she had learned early that silence offered more honestly than comfort that wasn't earned. They stood there for a while, then they went back inside. The next morning Owen took her to the tree. She had not asked him. He appeared at the kitchen door while she was washing the breakfast things, and he stood there in the threshold with his coat on and his boots laced, both of which meant he had dressed himself, which she had noticed he often did, with more care and independence than most children his age. And he looked at her with those light, serious eyes and said simply that he wanted to show her something. She dried her hands and got her coat. He led her across the yard and through the near paddock gate and down a path through the grass that was not quite a path, more the suggestion of one, the kind made by a single person, walking the same route enough times that the grass remembered it. The tree was a cottonwood, old and thick-trunked, set back from the fence line in a low place where the ground stayed damper longer after rain. It had good branches for climbing, though she did not think Owen came here to climb. He knelt beside the base of the trunk, where a section of the root system had lifted the soil into a low ridge that created a natural hollow underneath. He dug with both hands, careful and deliberate, and she crouched beside him and watched, and after a moment he lifted from the hollow a tin box, the kind that might once have held biscuits, its lid gone dull with weather. He held it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a ring, plain gold, simple, and a piece of paper, folded many times into a small square. Owen held the ring carefully, the way he held breakable things, and then he set it in Wren's palm without being asked, as though he had already decided she was the right person to give it to. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was unfolding the paper with the focused care of someone handling something precious, and when it was open, he held it so she could read it, and she did. The handwriting was neat, small, pressed hard into the paper the way a person writes when they are writing something they need to stay legible. Owen, it said, Mama loves you more than all the sky. I'm going to come back for you. Keep this safe until I do. Remember that you are loved every day, even the days you can't feel it. Wren read it twice. She looked at the ring still lying in her palm. She thought about Ada packing her case. She thought about a woman who had planned to leave, who had hidden her ring and written a note for her son, who had put everything she intended to return to in a tin box at the base of a tree where only Owen would know to look. A woman who had expected to come back. She closed her hand around the ring. Owen was watching her face. He was doing the thing she had noticed him do, reading her carefully, checking what he found there against whatever he was hoping to find. She looked at him and did not try to make her face anything other than what it was. She was going to come back for you, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady for him. She meant that. His face did the complicated thing again, the thing of holding something large. And then, for the first time in the days she had known him, his eyes filled, not the muffled, practiced crying of the nighttime, but the sudden, helpless filling of a child confronted with something true. He did not sob. He just sat there with his eyes full and his hands in the dirt and let it happen. And she moved to sit beside him and put her arm around his narrow shoulders, and he leaned into her. And they stayed that way under the old cottonwood tree for a long time. She was still holding the ring when she heard the sound. Silas, standing at the edge of the path through the grass, 20 feet back, hat in his hands. He had come after them, or come the same direction for another reason, and had stopped when he saw them. He stood very still, looking at the two of them under the tree, and his face, she could see it from where she sat, even at this distance, was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not the careful blankness, not the controlled neutrality. Something older and more unguarded, something that came from a part of him he did not usually allow to be visible. He turned and walked back toward the barn. She let him go. She stayed under the cottonwood for a moment after he had gone, Owen's weight still warm against her side, though he had straightened up now and was wiping his face with the back of his hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who understands that crying is a thing that happens and then ends. She looked at the hollow in the roots where the tin box had lived. She thought about the woman who had knelt in this same spot, who had dug down into the earth with the same careful hands, who had placed these objects there with the particular deliberateness of someone who did not know when she would return, but was certain she would. Ada had known something, Wren thought, had known it even in the middle of her fear. The child was worth the trying, worth the packing and the planning and the hope that someone would come who would understand what the hiding meant. She had understood. She thought that was what she had really come west for, though she could not have known it when she followed the word future down the long road. Not a house, not an arrangement. This, the chance to understand something that needed understanding. Owen's hand found hers on the way back through the grass. He did not say anything about it. He simply took her hand and walked beside her, and she matched his pace, and they went back to the ranch together through the morning light. That evening, after Owen was in bed and Fletcher had retreated to the front room, she found Silas at the corral, checking the latch on the gate in the last of the daylight. She came to stand beside him, and she held out the ring without preamble. He looked at it in her palm. He did not touch it. She hid it for him, Wren said, under the cottonwood, with a note. She was coming back for him. His jaw was tight. He looked at the ring for a long moment. I know, he said. She closed her hand and put the ring in her coat pocket. Tell me about your wife. The question surprised him. She could see it surprise him, the brief opening in his expression before it closed again. He looked at the gate latch he was holding, then released it. He put his hands in his pockets. Her name was Rose, he said, after a pause. She came out here with me when I took the position. She thought the land was beautiful. A longer pause. There was no doctor within a reasonable distance. When the time came, when she needed one, I rode out to find one, and I was gone long enough that it didn't matter by the time I got back. He said it plainly, not without feeling. She could hear the feeling, compressed and controlled beneath every word. But plainly, the way a man says something he has said to himself so many times, it has become the factual record rather than the living wound. But the wound was still there. She could see it was still there. You've been blaming yourself for 4 years, she said. I brought her here, he said. I knew the distance. I thought it would be all right. A pause. I was wrong. She was quiet for a moment because she understood what that kind of wrong felt like from the inside. The weight of a decision made without knowing it would be the wrong one, and the impossibility of ever going back to the moment before you made it. I lost a child, she said. She had not said it to anyone in this territory. She had not said it to anyone in longer than she could remember. A girl. She didn't live long enough to be named. My husband blamed me, or if he didn't blame me exactly, he needed somewhere to put the grief, and I was the nearest place. She paused. I don't know if that's better or worse than blaming yourself. Both feel like carrying something you can never set down. Silas looked at her. He had turned slightly toward her, the way a person turns when they are really listening rather than waiting for the other person to finish. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it, which was rarer than it should have been. I'm sorry about Rose, she said. She meant it in the way that mattered, the way that meant something that did not need saying aloud. The particular shape of that loss, not as an abstraction, but as a weight she recognized from the inside. The loss of someone who had trusted you to keep them safe. The permanence of having not kept them. The way that kind of failure attaches itself to everything that comes after, not loudly, not always, but always, present in the background of a life. They stood at the corral gate in the last of the evening light, not quite looking at each other, not quite looking away. The darkness was coming in from the east, spreading across the land with the patient inevitability of things that had all the time they needed. A horse moved in the corral, a soft sound of hooves in dry earth. Harlan Creed, she said eventually. That's the name Mrs. Lenora gave me. The man with the gray horse. She felt him still beside her. He was there that night, she said, when Ada disappeared. Mrs. Lenora saw his horse. A long silence. The darkness came in a little further. Creed and Fletcher have been connected for years, Silas said slowly. Land dealings mostly. Fletcher acquires property through arrangements that aren't always straightforward, and Creed provides the standing that makes those arrangements hold. He paused. If Creed was here the night Ada disappeared, then whatever happened to her, he's part of it. And if he's part of it, then any move against Fletcher goes through Creed first. Another pause. That's why nothing has held. That's why the wall is where it is. Then we need someone outside that wall, Wren said. He looked at her. Someone with enough standing of their own, she said. Someone who passes through, who isn't part of what Creed controls. Someone whose word would carry weight that Creed can't undermine. She looked out at the darkening land. Mrs. Lenora told me there's a man, a trader, comes through twice a year, has dealings with ranches across the territory, knows people, carries information and reputation the way traders do. She said he's due through in the next week or so. Aldous Merritt, Silas said slowly. I know who you mean. Can he be trusted? Silas considered. He's an honest man. I've known him to be honest at personal cost, which is a better test than most. He paused. If he were to hear what Mrs. Lenora witnessed, with her willing to say it outright, that's not nothing. That's a credible account from a woman who has been here 11 years to a man who is known and respected across the territory and not beholden to Creed or anyone like him. Then that's the way, Wren said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking, the quality of his silence shifting as he worked through it. Fletcher will notice, he said, if you're seen talking to Merritt when he comes through. If it looks like anything more than a passing conversation, Fletcher will notice and he will act before we have anything solid enough to matter. Then it can't look like anything more than a passing conversation, Wren said. He looked at her sidelong. You're not afraid of him. I'm afraid of what happens to Owen if nothing changes, she said. That's the kind of fear that makes the other kind smaller. Something moved in his face again. That older, less guarded thing. Fletcher moved the date, he said. Yesterday, when you were in the garden with Mrs. Lenora, he told me. 5 days now, not 2 weeks. He paused. He said he wanted things settled before he made arrangements for Owen. The word arrangements landed in her chest like something cold. What arrangements? She said. He didn't say. He said it was time for the boy to be with family. He said it easily, the way he says things he's already decided. Silas's voice had gone quiet and flat. There is no family. Ada had no one out here. Fletcher has a cousin in another territory who has never shown any interest in Owen. He paused. I don't know what arrangements means, but I know what the word sounds like when it's being used as a replacement for something else. Wren stood very still. 5 days. She thought about Owen under the cottonwood tree, handing her the ring with both hands. She thought about the note written in small pressed letters, every day, even the ones you can't feel it. She thought about a case packed neatly in the storeroom, folded clothes, a woman who had expected to come back. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the ring there, and her fingers found the folded cloth beside it, both of them together in the dark of the pocket. If it's 5 days, she said carefully, then we need Merritt here sooner than a week. I can ride out tomorrow, Silas said. I know the route he usually takes. If I leave early, I can intercept him and ask him to come through ahead of schedule. I have reason enough to visit. It won't look unusual." She looked at him. He was looking at her. And in the near dark, his face was as open as she had seen it. All the careful neutrality at rest. The wall he kept between himself and most things lowered just enough to let her see what was behind it. Not nothing. A man who had stood outside a door for 18 months, holding the weight of what he had not done, and who was now deciding, deliberately, consciously, to stand somewhere different. "When you come back," she said, "we'll need Mrs. Lenora ready to speak, and we'll need whatever you know about that night put into words. Out loud." He held her gaze. "I know what I heard. I can say it." She nodded. He reached out, slowly, the way you move around animals that are not yet used to you, and his hand settled briefly over hers where it rested on the gate rail, not holding, not gripping, just present, just there, warm and real in the cooling evening air. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The hand moved away after a moment, and they stood apart again, looking out at the darkness. "If we do this," he said, "and it doesn't hold, if Creed is able to push back hard enough that Merritt's account doesn't matter, then we'll find another way," she said. He was quiet. "There is no version of this," she said, "where I sign whatever Fletcher puts in front of me and watch him take Owen somewhere and tell myself it isn't my business." She said it quietly and absolutely, with the certainty of a woman who has made the decision fully and does not need to make it again. "There is no version of this where I walk away from that child." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and the nod had the quality of something settled. He left at first light. She watched from the high window of her room as he rode out through the gray morning, and she stayed at the window until he was past the first rise and gone from sight. Then she turned back to the room, and she thought about 5 days, and she began to move. She had things to do. She had always known what to do when there was something worth doing. Silas came back on the second day. Wren heard the horse before she saw him, a sound that cut through the late afternoon quiet of the yard faster than his usual pace, and she was at the window before she had decided to move. He rode in through the main gate and dismounted in a single motion and led the horse toward the barn without stopping, which meant he had something to say that needed the cover of walls around it. She waited 10 minutes, enough time for him to settle the horse, and then she walked to the barn with the unhurried manner of someone checking on nothing in particular. He was inside. He had not unsaddled the horse yet, which told her something about the state of his mind. He was standing at the stall door with his hand on the latch and his hat still on, and the look on his face was the look of a man carrying news he has not yet decided how to deliver. She closed the barn door behind her. "Merritt is coming," he said. "Day after tomorrow." He moved his route without much argument. He's heard things, apparently, about this territory, about Creed. He didn't say what, exactly, but he wasn't surprised when I told him there was something that needed a credible witness. He paused. "He'll come through as a matter of ordinary trade. He'll stop here as he always does, and if there's a conversation to be had, he'll have it. But it has to happen in a window Fletcher doesn't control." "Fletcher rides out most mornings," Wren said. "He's gone until midday." "That's the window, then." He finally moved, pulling the saddle from the horse and setting it on the rail. "Mrs. Lenora needs to be ready to speak." Everything she saw, everything she heard, said plainly to a man who has the standing to carry it somewhere, "It will matter." He paused. And I need to be ready to say what I know. I'll speak to Mrs. Lenora tonight, Wren said. He nodded. He began rubbing the horse down, the methodical motion of someone whose hands needed to do something while his mind worked on something else. There's more, she said. It was not a question. He stopped. He looked at her over the horse's back. Creed is coming. Fletcher sent a rider out while I was gone. One of the hands told me. Creed is expected the day before the ceremony. He paused. He's never come for the ceremony of a thing before. He doesn't attend arrangements. He comes when there's a reason beyond the social occasion. She held very still. What reason? I don't know. But I know what the last time looked like. He held her gaze. We need this settled before Creed arrives. If Merritt comes the morning after tomorrow, and Fletcher rides out on schedule, and Mrs. Lenora speaks, we need it to be enough. We need Merritt to carry it before Creed gets here, and the ground shifts again. One day. They had one day of ordinary time before everything converged. She thought about Owen. She thought about the word arrangements. It will be enough, she said. She was not entirely certain, but she said it with the certainty she had, which was the kind built not from knowing the outcome, but from knowing the choice. That night, Fletcher called her to the front room. He was sitting by the fire with a glass of something amber in his hand and the relaxed posture of a man on his own ground, and he gestured to the chair across from him in a way that was an invitation shaped exactly like a command. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap and kept her face at the temperature she had learned to maintain, warm enough to be readable, not so warm as to be vulnerable. I want to speak plainly, he said. She waited. You've settled in well, he said. Better than I expected, frankly. Some women struggle with the adjustment. He swirled the glass once, looking at it rather than at her. Owen has taken to you. That's useful. It will make the transition easier for him. What transition? She said. He looked up. The firelight moved across his face, and she thought, not for the first time, about what was behind the smooth presentation. It was not cruelty, precisely. It was something more deliberate than cruelty. Cruelty was emotional. What she saw in Fletcher Guard's face was the expression of a man who had decided long ago that other people were variables in arrangements, not participants in them. I have a responsibility to the boy, he said. He needs proper schooling, proper formation. There are institutions better suited to providing that than what's available here. A man in my position with the kind of work the ranch requires. It's not the environment for raising a child. He paused. Once things are settled between us, I intend to make arrangements for his placement somewhere more suitable. The word again, placement. She kept her face at exactly the temperature it needed to be. She breathed steadily, the way she had learned to breathe in situations where her body wanted to do something, and she needed it to do something else instead. He's 6, she said. Yes. He lost his mother. Children are resilient, Fletcher said, with the easy confidence of someone who had never been required to test that belief from the inside. He'll adjust. He looked at her with the measuring look she had seen him use on things he was assessing for value. You seem attached to him. He's a child, she said, in need of consistency, which he will have, Fletcher said, in the right environment. He set the glass down. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. I know some women develop investments in situations like this. I thought it kinder to be clear about the arrangement from the outset, so there's no misunderstanding about what the role here involves. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Ada, who had sat in this same house, possibly in this same room, and had packed her case and hidden a ring and written a note for her son, and had not made it out the door. "Thank you for being direct," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I appreciate knowing where things stand." He nodded, satisfied, and she excused herself and went upstairs. And she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and breathed, carefully, in and out, until her hands stopped wanting to shake. Then she got up and went to tell Mrs. Lenora to be ready. Aldous Merritt arrived the next morning at 8:30, when the sky was still carrying the pale colors of early day, and Fletcher Guard had been gone for an hour already, riding southwest along the fence line on an inspection that routinely took him until midday or beyond. Merritt was a broad, plain-faced man of perhaps 55, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, and the steady, unhurried bearing of someone who had learned that hurrying rarely improved outcomes. He drove a heavy wagon with a canvas cover and pulled into the yard with the ease of a man who had pulled into this yard before, and expected nothing unusual from it. He called out a greeting to the hand who came to meet him, accepted the offer of water for his team, and made his way toward the house with the purposeful calm of a man conducting ordinary business. Mrs. Lenora brought him into the kitchen. Wren was already there. She had been there since before Fletcher left, moving through the morning tasks with the focused attention of someone whose mind was doing several things at once and needed her hands to do something simple. She looked up when Merritt came in, and he looked at her, and they took the measure of each other across the kitchen in the way that people do when they have been told about each other by someone they trust. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was even and dry, the voice of someone who was used to being the steadiest thing in a room. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "thank you for coming." He sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Lenora sat across from him, her hands folded on the surface, her back straight, her face set with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. Silas came in from the yard and pulled the door to and stood with his back against it, not quite sitting, present in the way he was always present. Wren stood at the end of the table. She did not sit. She felt that the moment required her to be standing. "I'll tell you what we're here to tell you," she said, "and then I'll let Mrs. Lenora and Silas speak for what they know. And I'll ask you to judge the weight of it and tell us honestly whether it's enough to carry somewhere it will matter." Merritt looked at her steadily. "That's a fair way to proceed," he said. She told him about Ada. She told him about the case in the storeroom, packed and left. She told him about the drawing Owen had made, and the ring in the tin box under the tree, and the note that said, "I'm going to come back for you." She told him what Owen had said in his small, rusty voice. "I heard her, loud, and then I didn't hear her anymore." She told him about Harlan Creed's gray horse in the yard that night, and about the way Fletcher had described Ada's disappearance as a leaving when nothing about the evidence supported a leaving. She told it plainly and in order, without drama, because the facts themselves contained enough. Then Mrs. Lenora spoke. The old woman's voice was steady in the way of someone who has been preparing for a long time without knowing they were preparing. She described the night precisely, every detail fixed and clear through the long months of private repetition. Ada's voice rising above the men's voices, high with urgency, and then silenced. The horse without a lantern. Fletcher returning alone to the house. The morning that followed, ordinary in every visible way, with one thing simply absent from it. Then Silas. He spoke with his eyes on the table, not from shame but from concentration, the focus of someone making certain that every word was exactly accurate. He described the sound that had woken him, the walk to the house, the door he had stood outside, what he had heard through it, the argument, the sound of something falling, silence, and then Fletcher's voice, low and settled, speaking to someone in the manner of a man concluding a transaction. He described going back to the bunkhouse. He described the 18 months of carrying it. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Merritt had not interrupted any of them. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his face carrying the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was being given had weight, and that weight required respect. He looked at each of them in turn. He was quiet for a moment after Silas stopped speaking. "Harlan Creed," he said finally. "Yes," Silas said. Merritt nodded slowly. "I've had dealings with Creed. I know his reach in this territory, and I know its limits." He paused. "It has limits. He would prefer people not know that, but it has them." He looked at Wren. "What you've given me here, an account from 3 people, each with their own direct knowledge, without contradiction between them. That's not nothing. That's considerably more than nothing." "Is it enough?" Wren said. "It's enough to require a proper inquiry," he said. "An honest one, conducted by someone outside Creed's reach. I know such a person. He has the standing and the influence, and he is not a man who can be managed by social pressure or financial arrangement." He paused. "It will take time. I won't pretend it will be swift, but it will be real." Wren looked at him steadily. "Creed arrives tomorrow, before Fletcher's ceremony." Something shifted in Merritt's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a reassessment of timing. "Then I'll ride today," he said, "before I'm through this territory." He looked at Mrs. Lenora, then at Silas. "Each of you, be prepared to say again, to another person, what you've said in this room, plainly, as you've said it here." Mrs. Lenora said she would. Silas said he would. Merritt looked at Wren last. "And you, Miss Calloway, you understand that once this is in motion, it is in motion. There's no arrangement you can make with Fletcher Guard that puts you outside of what you've set going." "I don't want an arrangement with Fletcher Guard," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and pushed back from the table. He was gone within the hour, his wagon out the gate and down the road before Fletcher's return. And the yard looked afterward exactly as it had before, because that was the point. Nothing visible, nothing to explain. Just a trader who had come through on his ordinary route and continued on it. The afternoon passed with a specific tension of waiting. Fletcher returned at midday and moved through the house with his usual manner, and if he noticed anything different in the quality of the air, he gave no sign of it. Wren stayed useful and visible and performed the ordinary motions of the day. Mrs. Lenora cooked. Silas worked the fence line on the far side of the property. Owen found her in the kitchen in the late afternoon. He came and stood beside her at the counter and did not say anything for a while, just stood there in the way he had of wanting proximity without asking for it, and she moved to give him room to be close without making a production of it. After a while he said quietly, "Is something happening?" She looked down at him. She thought about what a 6-year-old needed to hear and what he was owed in the way of honesty. And she found the place between those two things. "Yes," she said, "some people who want good things to happen are working on making them happen." He was quiet, processing this. "Does it work?" he said. "Do good things happen from that?" "Sometimes," she said, "when the right people decide they want them to." He thought about this for a moment. Then he leaned, very slightly, against her arm. She did not move. She let him stay there. That night, Fletcher locked Owen's door. She did not know it until she went to check on him at the usual hour and found the latch would not turn, and heard nothing from inside. She stood at the door and pressed her palm flat against the wood, and stood there for a moment. Then she heard it. Small, deliberate. A sound. A rhythmic, careful tapping from the other side. Not distressed. Intentional. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. He knew she was there. He was telling her he knew. She tapped back. 3. Pause. 3. Then she straightened and went downstairs, and she found Silas in the kitchen doorway, having come in from the yard. She told him about the door. His jaw tightened. "Creed will be here by mid-morning tomorrow," he said. "Then we don't have tomorrow," she said. "We have tonight." He looked at her steadily. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking the latch on that door is the same model as the one on the storeroom," she said. "And I opened the storeroom latch with a hairpin in about 40 seconds 3 days ago." A pause. "Fletcher sleeps heavy," Silas said slowly. "I've heard him. And the floor on that hall doesn't creak if you stay to the left side." "Then left side it is," she said. He straightened from the door frame. "I'll be at the bottom of the stairs," he said. "Whatever you need." She went upstairs. She moved along the left side of the hallway, her footsteps silent on the boards, the small lamp held low. The hairpin was already in her hand. She had taken it from her hair an hour ago, when she understood that the night was going to require it. The latch took longer than the storeroom. The mechanism was stiffer, the pin needing more adjustment than she had expected, and she worked it in the near dark with the patient, deliberate focus of someone who did not have the option of giving up. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. The steadiness that came not from the absence of fear, but from having something more important than fear to attend to. The latch gave. She opened the door. Owen was awake. He was sitting up in the bed, fully dressed, his coat on, his boots laced, in the precise manner of a child who had been waiting. He had packed, she realized, a small bundle beside him on the blanket, the tin box from under the cottonwood tree on top of it. He had understood somehow, without being told explicitly, that tonight was different from other nights. He looked at her when the door opened, and in the dim light of the lamp, she could see his face clearly enough to know that he was afraid, and that he was not going to let the fear stop him. She held out her hand. He took it. He picked up his bundle with the other arm, and he came with her, quietly, quickly, along the left side of the hall. They were at the top of the stairs when the light came on below. Not the soft light of a lamp, the broader, flatter light of a lantern held high, and beneath it the tall figure of Fletcher Guard standing at the foot of the stairs, looking up. He had not been asleep. He had been waiting. The mask was entirely gone. Not the calculated charm, not the measured warmth, not the precise social performance she had been studying since she arrived. What was there instead was the face beneath all of that. And it was not monstrous, which in some ways was worse. It was simply cold. The face of a man who had already calculated what came next and was not troubled by the calculation. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was the same, exactly the same register, the same even tone, as though the hour and the circumstance were entirely ordinary. "I think you should bring the boy downstairs." She was still holding Owen's hand. She felt him press closer to her side. She tightened her grip, not in panic, just an answer to the question he was asking with his body, which was, "Are you still here?" And she was answering, "Yes, still here." She looked down the stairs at Fletcher Guard, and she said, very quietly and very clearly, "No." Something shifted in his face. A small recalculation. Not anger. He was too controlled for anger. But adjustment, the way a man adjusts when a variable performs differently than expected. "This is my house," he said. "I know that," she said, "and Owen is not a piece of it." A pause. The lantern light moved slightly as his grip on it adjusted. "You don't understand what you're involving yourself in," he said. "I understand it exactly," she said. Then, from behind Fletcher, the kitchen door opened. Silas walked in. He did not hurry. He came through the kitchen door and into the hall and stopped behind Fletcher Guard. And he stood there in the way he always stood, contained still, deliberate. And he looked up the stairs at Wren and Owen, and then he looked at the back of Fletcher Guard's head. Fletcher turned. The two men looked at each other, and the quality of the silence between them was the silence of a long history arriving at the moment it had been building toward. All the years of necessary cordiality and careful distance and the unspoken weight of what Silas knew and had not said, all of it present in the 10 feet of hallway between them. "Silas," Fletcher said. His voice had changed now, just slightly. Not afraid, but recalculating again, more significantly this time. "Merritt's already gone," Silas said. His voice was very quiet. "He left this afternoon. He took what Mrs. Lenora and I told him, and he's carrying it to someone who can do something with it. Someone outside this territory's arrangements." He paused. "It's already in motion, Fletcher. Tonight doesn't change that." The lantern light was very still. "You've been here 4 years," Fletcher said. "I have," Silas said. "And I've known what I knew for 18 months of them. I should have said it sooner." He paused. "I'm saying it now." The silence stretched. Mrs. Lenora appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Silas, her robe on, her white hair loose, her face carrying the expression of a woman who had made her decision and was done being afraid of it. Fletcher Guard looked at all of them. He looked up the stairs at Wren, at Owen's small figure pressed to her side. He looked at the tin box under the boy's arm. Something moved in his face. The first thing she had seen move there that was not performance or calculation. And she did not know what it was. And it did not matter. He set the lantern on the hall table. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then he walked to the front room and sat down. And he did not get up again. Wren came down the stairs slowly, her hand still in Owen's. At the bottom, she let Silas take the boy. The transfer instinctive, unspoken. Owen going to him without hesitation. Silas's hand coming down on the boy's shoulder with the steadiness of something that had been quietly present for a long time. She walked to the front room doorway. Fletcher Guard was sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace, his hands on the arms of it, looking at nothing. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had reached the end of a long and very specific road and found it exactly as empty as he had perhaps always known it would be. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned away and went back to where Silas and Owen were waiting. Owen looked up at her when she came back. His face in the lamplight was serious and young and carrying too much for 6 years old. And also, underneath all of that, tentative and new as something just beginning, something else, the beginning of believing that the ground might hold. He held the tin box against his chest with both arms. He looked at Wren, then at Silas, then back at Wren. And then, with the careful deliberateness of a child who has decided that a thing is worth saying out loud, "Are you staying?" She looked at him. She looked at Silas, who was looking at her with the steady, open look she had come to understand over these days. The look that was no longer deciding, no longer assessing, just present, just there. She crouched down to Owen's level, the way she had learned he needed, so the words could travel the short distance between them without having to come down from a height. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." The inquiry came 3 weeks later. It arrived not with noise or spectacle, but with the quiet authority of something that had been set in motion by the right person and allowed to travel at its own pace. 2 men rode in on a morning when the sky was the color of pale ash and the wind had finally decided to rest. One of them the figure Merritt had vouched for, a man of considerable standing in territories well beyond Creed's reach, the kind of man whose presence at a property meant that whatever happened next would be recorded and remembered. The other was younger, a recorder of accounts, who said very little and wrote a great deal in a leather-bound book he kept close. They stayed 4 days. They spoke to Mrs. Lenora first at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had made for herself and not touched. She told them everything she had told Wren in the garden, and she told it with the same flat precision, every detail in its place, the kind of account that comes from someone who has rehearsed nothing because the truth does not require rehearsal. The night. Ada's voice rising and then silenced, the horse moving in darkness without a light to guide it. Fletcher's ordinary manner at breakfast the following morning, and Ada's absence from the table she had sat at for 7 months. The 18 months of saying nothing, stated plainly, without excuses offered. They wrote it down. They spoke to Silas in the barn, which was his choosing, because he said what he had to say more easily when his hands had something to do. He talked and worked, and the younger man wrote, and when Silas described standing outside the door, the walk from the bunkhouse, the sound through the wood, the decision not to go in, he stopped working for a moment and was quiet, and the men waited, and then he continued. He did not look for their judgment. He had already given himself enough of that for the past 18 months, and he was done with the excess of it now. He said what he knew. He said it clearly. They examined the storeroom. They opened Ada's case and inventoried its contents without removing them, noting the folded quality of the clothes, the careful arrangement of someone who had packed with intention and time. The younger man wrote several pages about the case alone, which told Wren, watching from the doorway, that the case mattered to them as much as it had mattered to her the first time she had seen it. They spoke to 2 of the ranch hands, men who had been at Guard Ranch longer than Silas, who had their own fragments to contribute, small things seen and half understood at the time, that fit together now with the other pieces in ways that clarified the picture. One of them had seen Creed's gray horse in the yard that night. He had thought nothing of it then, because Creed came and went from this property as he pleased. He remarked on it now, in full. On the 3rd day, they spoke to Owen. Wren had asked to be present, and the men had agreed without hesitation, and the 3 of them sat in the kitchen, Owen on his usual chair, Wren beside him, the 2 men across the table. And the senior man spoke to the boy in the careful, unhurried way of someone who understood that children were not small adults, but were also not fragile, and that the distance between those 2 misapprehensions was where the truth usually lived. Owen sat straight. He had dressed himself that morning with more care than usual. He answered the questions in his small, factual voice. He described the night the way he had described it to Wren under the cottonwood tree. I heard her, loud, and then I didn't hear her anymore. And he described the morning, And the way Fletcher had explained Ada's absence in a tone that Owen, even at 6, had understood, was not the tone of a true thing. He said this last part without being prompted. He said, "It didn't sound like the way things sound when they are real." The man writing in the leather book paused and looked up when Owen said that, and then wrote it down exactly. Because sometimes a child says the truest thing in the room. Owen held the tin box in his lap through the whole conversation. He had brought it without being asked. At the end, when the men thanked him and said he had done well, he opened the box and showed them the ring and the note, and he let the younger man copy out the words of the note into the leather book, and then he folded the note back the way he had found it and closed the lid. Wren watched him do all of this and felt something in her chest that did not have a simple name, something that was grief and its opposite at once, the feeling of witnessing a child carry more than a child should have to carry, and carry it with more dignity than many adults managed. She put her hand over his when the box was closed. He turned his hand over and held hers. Fletcher Guard did not resist the inquiry in any way that mattered. By the time the men arrived, Creed had already retreated, had sent word of a delay, and then gone silent, which was its own form of answer. Without the architecture of Creed's backing, Fletcher was simply a man in a house, with a history that could no longer be managed by the same arrangements that had always managed it before. He answered the men's questions with the surface cordiality that was his most practiced skill, and the cordiality fooled no one. He signed what they put in front of him without argument. He left on the 5th morning with what he could fit in the back of the smaller wagon. Wren watched from the upstairs window, not because she needed to see him go, but because she needed to confirm that he had. The wagon went through the gate and down the road and over the first rise and was gone. And the yard was quiet in his absence in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the tense quiet of something held back, but the open quiet of a space that had been returned to itself. She went downstairs. Owen was in the kitchen with Mrs. Lenora, sitting at the table with a glass of milk, watching the older woman cut biscuits with the focused attention of someone studying a technique. He did not mention Fletcher's leaving. He drank his milk and asked Mrs. Lenora if he could press the next one, and she said he could if he was careful about the edges. And he was very careful about the edges. Wren stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them and felt the quiet of a morning that was only itself, nothing more required of it, nothing held underneath it waiting to surface. The ranch required decisions, and Silas made most of them, because the ranch was what he knew, and because there was a period in which everything needed to continue regardless of what had shifted in the human arrangements around it. The horses needed tending. The fence line needed finishing. The hands needed direction, and the ordinary acknowledgement of people who had stayed through something difficult and deserved to know their position was solid. Silas moved through all of it with the purposeful steadiness she had recognized in him from the first morning, but something had shifted. She could see the difference even when she was not looking directly at him, in the set of his shoulders, which had released something they had been carrying for a long time. In the way he spoke to the hands, which had always been measured but was now easier, less vigilant. In the small, rare appearances of something in his face that she had not seen there in sufficient quantity before. He smiled sometimes, not broadly, not frequently, but it appeared at the table when Owen said something unexpectedly precise, in the yard when the old chestnut mare did something characteristically contrary, in the evenings when the three of them sat on the porch in the cooling air and the land went gold and quiet around them. The smile appeared and then settled back into the usual steadiness, but it left something behind each time. a warmth that accumulated, the way light accumulates in a room where a window has finally been opened. The weeks that followed had a quality she had not experienced in a long time. There was still work. There was always work on a working property, and she had come to understand that the work was not separate from the life, but was the shape the life took, the way water takes the shape of the thing it fills. She rose early and slept when the day was done, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that this was not the diminishment she might once have feared. It was something else. It was the satisfaction of days that contain what they need to contain, and nothing they do not. Owen settled into himself the way children settle when the pressure that has been shaping them is finally removed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, the way a hand unclenches after holding something for a very long time. He began to take up more space. He left his coat on the hook without checking that it was straight. He tracked mud into the kitchen and looked at it with brief concern, but not the flinching terror of a child who expects disproportionate consequence. He began to remember, it seemed, that he was 6 years old, and that being 6 years old had particular permissions attached to it that he had suspended for some time. He asked Silas once on a slow afternoon in the barn if he could try brushing the mare. Silas showed him the direction of the grain, the pressure that felt like a hand rather than a tool, the way the horse would tell you with her ears if you were doing it wrong. Owen was serious and attentive and remarkably patient, and the mare tolerated him with the good grace of an animal that has decided someone is worth the effort. When they came in for supper that evening, Owen's sleeve was covered in dust and chestnut hair, and he held out his arm to show Wren with an expression of undisguised pride. She said it was a good sleeve. He agreed that it was. Mrs. Lenora stayed. She had, she told Wren one evening, been thinking about leaving for 11 years, and she had arrived, finally, at the understanding that the thing she had been unable to leave was not the place, but the people who were becoming the place. Owen, and now Silas, and now Wren herself. She said this without ceremony, while washing the supper dishes, and Wren received it the same way, because some things are said most truly in the middle of ordinary tasks, when neither person has time to be careful about it. She was in the supply room one afternoon, reorganizing the shelves, a task that needed doing, and that gave her hands something useful while her mind moved through the things that still needed thinking about. When she heard his boots at the threshold, she kept her hands moving, giving him the space his nature required to say things in his own time. "Owen asked me something this morning," he said. She turned. He was in the doorway, hat in his hands, the posture he used when he was being deliberate. "What did he ask?" "Whether you were going to stay." He paused. Not for a while. He was specific about that distinction. He asked if you were going to stay the way people stay when they mean it. She set down the jar she was holding. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know, because I thought it was yours to answer." He paused. "But I think he needs to hear it from you. And I think—" He stopped. The hat turned slowly in his hands. "I think I need to hear it, too. What you want. What you're planning. I don't need it to be anything particular. I just need it to be honest." She looked at him for a moment. Outside the supply room window, the light was the amber of late afternoon, the kind of light that made the land look like it had been painted by someone who understood the value of warmth. She thought about the letter she had carried for so long, the careful sentences describing a future of some kind. She thought about how far that phrase had brought her, and what she had found at the end of the road it described, I didn't come here knowing what I was walking into, she said. I came because there was nothing left where I was, and going somewhere felt more honest than staying in the same place performing the same grief. She paused. But this is different. What's here now? Owen, this land, the work of it, you. It's different from what I came toward. And I'm not staying because the alternative is worse. I'm staying because I want to be here. She met his eyes. That's the first time I've been able to say that and mean it fully about any place in longer than I can remember. He looked at her steadily. Then he looked down at the hat in his hands, and when he looked back up, his face had the open, unguarded quality that she had come to understand was the most honest version of him. I put Rose's boots away, he said. 2 days ago, I put them in the cedar chest in the loft, wrapped in the cloth she would have used. He paused. I'm not done remembering her. I'm not looking to be done. But I kept them where they were for 4 years because moving them felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. He paused again. I think what I wasn't ready to admit was that I was still here, that I had kept going, and that keeping going meant something, that I was allowed to let it mean something. She understood that. She put her hand to the pocket of her dress, felt the familiar shape of the folded cloth inside. I understand that, she said quietly. Holding something because you need it, and holding it because you've forgotten how to let your hands be empty, and not knowing, for a long time, which one it is. What did you decide? He said. About what you carry. She pulled the handkerchief from her pocket. She looked at it in her palm, the small square of cloth, the violet flowers along the edge, the weight of everything it had carried for her across a long and difficult road. She thought about the girl it had been meant for. She thought about the distance between that loss and this afternoon. I'm keeping it, she said, but not the same way. Not to mark what I lost, to remember why I kept moving after I lost it. She folded it once and put it back. There's a difference between those two things. It took me a while to find it. He nodded slowly. He set his hat on the shelf beside the door, a small gesture, deliberate and unhurried, and he crossed the room and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see clearly the lines around his eyes and the particular quality of his stillness when he was not managing it for anyone else's benefit. I'm not practiced at this, he said, at saying things that matter directly. I know, she said. I want to try anyway. He was quiet for a moment, gathering it. I would like you to stay. Not because the ranch needs a steadying hand, and not only because Owen needs what you give him, though both of those things are true, and I won't pretend they aren't. But because I would like to see what it looks like to build something here, and have someone to build it alongside. He paused. I haven't wanted that. Not since Rose. I notice that I want it now. I wanted you to know that I notice it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then let's find out what it looks like, she said. Something in his face settled. Not the relieved settling of a man who feared a different answer, but the quieter settling of a man who had hoped for something and received it and was now simply present with the fact of it. He reached out and took her hand, the way he did everything, slowly, with intention, in the manner of someone who planned to stay. They stood that way in the supply room with the afternoon light coming through the small window and the ranch sounds outside moving through the air around them, ordinary and continuous and real. Then Owen's voice came from the yard. He was calling for Silas with the urgency of a child who has discovered something that cannot wait, will not wait, requires immediate adult verification before it can be properly understood. Silas looked toward the door. The edge of his mouth moved. "It's always urgent," Wren said. "Everything is," he said. "At 6. He picked up his hat and went out, and she followed. Owen was at the far paddock fence, pointing into the long grass beyond it. He had found a small burrowing creature, round and purposeful, moving through the grass with the focused certainty of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no doubts about the route. Silas crouched beside him and looked where he was pointing, and Owen explained the creature in considerable detail, including several things he could not possibly know for certain, but stated with full confidence, because that was how Owen approached most things now. Wren came to stand on Owen's other side. He glanced up at her when she arrived, a quick checking glance that confirmed she was there, and then went back to the creature. "Where does it live?" he said to Silas. "Underground, digs its own place, has rooms down there, tunnels connecting them." Owen considered this with great seriousness. "Does it know the way back?" "Every time," Silas said. "Goes out and comes back. Same place, same door." Owen was quiet for a moment, watching the creature reach the fence post and disappear into the grass beyond it. After it was gone, he kept looking at the place it had been, the way children look at things that have interested them, as though looking long enough might bring them back. "That's good," he said finally. "When you know the way back." He said it simply, and he did not say more, and neither Wren nor Silas offered an answer, because the thing he had said was already complete and did not need addition. She thought about the ring in the tin box, and the note that said, "Remember that you are loved every day, even the days you cannot feel it." She thought about Ada, who had packed carefully and planned to return, and had not made it out the door. She thought about what it meant that Owen was standing at a paddock fence on an ordinary morning, saying that it was good to know the way back, in the tone of a child who had found his footing and intended to keep it. Mrs. Lenora called from the kitchen. Breakfast was ready and would not improve from waiting. Owen went at a run, coat flapping, boots loud on the dry ground, calling back over his shoulder something about biscuits that was mostly lost to the wind. Wren watched him go. She watched until he disappeared through the kitchen door, and then she stood in the yard a moment longer with the morning light coming across the land behind her and the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney reaching her across the open ground. Silas was standing beside her. She had not heard him move to stand beside her, but he was there, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool morning air. "Mrs. Lenora's biscuits," he said. "I know," she said. "We shouldn't keep them waiting." But neither of them moved immediately. They stood in the yard in the morning light, looking at the kitchen door where Owen had disappeared, and at the smoke from the chimney, and at the land beyond the paddock fence, where the grass moved in the light wind, and the sky was the deep, committed blue of a day that had decided to be fully itself. The biscuits were waiting. The morning was waiting. The work of the day was arranged ahead of them in the ordinary, continuous way of a life that had things in it worth doing. The land she could see from here was not the land she had crossed in the wagon, enormous and pale and indifferent. This land knew her now, or she knew it. The cottonwood at the far fence line, the particular way the light fell across the paddock in the hour before midday, the sound the gate made when the wind was coming from the south. She had earned that knowledge through the weeks of paying attention, through choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier, through the stubborn, practical faith that some things were worth the trouble of remaining. She put her hand in her pocket. She felt the folded cloth there, the stitched flowers along its edge, familiar now as her own heartbeat. She had carried it as a weight for a long time, and it was still there, and it was hers, and it meant something different now than it had when she first placed it in her pocket on a cold morning in a different life, and began walking toward a future she could not see clearly. She could see it now. Not all of it. Not the details, not the shape of every year to come, but the ground of it, the kitchen and the paddock and the old cottonwood at the far fence line, the boy who knew the way back, the man standing beside her in the morning light, his hat on and his hands at his sides, present and steady and chosen. The land she could feel under her boots was the same hard-packed earth she had stepped onto the first day, dry and certain, indifferent to what people brought to it or took away from it. But she knew it now. She knew the way the morning light moved across the paddock and which corner of the garden held heat longest into the evening. She knew which horse would come to the fence if you stood at the rail long enough, and which would wait to be approached on its own terms. She knew the sound of the kitchen in the hour before supper, and the particular silence of the house after Owen had gone to sleep. This was what staying meant. Not the decision, made once and never revisited, but the accumulation of small knowings, one after another, until the place became yours, not by claim, but by attention. She could see enough. "Ready?" she said. He looked at her sidelong. Not a question in it, not this time. Just the word, returned. "Ready?" he said. They walked back to the house together across the yard, and behind them the light came fully over the eastern rise and spread across the land in long, golden sheets, and the grass caught it and held it, and the whole wide morning opened around them like something that had been waiting a long time for this particular day to begin,